Just past 7:08 in the morning. The show is Upfront. My name's Brian Edwards Teeger. We're going to start with trade this morning. On Friday, the Trump administration let go into effect new iteration of its so-called reciprocal tariffs, broad across the board tariffs against just about every country that the Trump administration has not worked out the outline of a deal with. This is supposedly in response to U.S. trade deficits. This week, a fresh batch of threats, most prominently targeting India for stiffer tariffs. This not so much in response to trade deficits, but to the Trump administration's concern that India has become a major purchaser of Russian oil. I thought it would be worth sorting out what we can discern amidst the chaos of how the Trump administration is using or how it is hoping to use tariffs and what the ultimate fallout might be. We've invited back on Lori Wallach, who's director of the Rethink trade program at the American Economic Liberties Project. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming back on the show. Let's start. Let's start with what went into effect on Friday, because it's been really hard to keep on top of what the actual tariff policy of the Trump administration is, because there's been so many pronouncements, rollbacks, postponements, deals, outlines of deals. Like, what is the current tariff regime for someone trying to import goods to the United States?
Well, that's a great question because it depends on the whim of the president, honestly. A bunch of these so-called agreements are not written down. Some of the terms of them actually are not actually possible in the physics of the economy. What we do know by executive order issued late the night before August 1st is rates for various countries. But as you've said, for India, there's a threat that that's changed. On paper, these rates are set in a scattershot of what I would call really hard to discern a strategy rate. So let me give you an example. We have a trade surplus with Brazil. We sell more things to Brazil than we buy from Brazil. And, ostensibly as a candidate and then as president, Trump has said the goal of these tariffs primarily are, and he sold this to working class Americans and wrote it right into the White House, are one, to rebalance trade, and two, to rebuild manufacturing. Both really important goals for our resilience in the midst of climate chaos, for economic justice, good goals. Are these tariffs doing that? So let's go back to Brazil. If you're trying to rebalance trade, you don't actually penalize the countries you have a trade surplus with. Brazil is the country right now with the highest rate of all of those announced, and it has nothing to do with trade. It is because President Trump is upset that his former political ally, the former president of Brazil, a right-wing failed coup guy, Jair Bolsonaro, is in court right now being tried for his coup. So these are just, I have a whim, I'm looking at what could have happened to me, I'm now going to hit things from Brazil with 50% tariffs. And just to put this into clear focus for folks, that's your coffee, that's orange juice. These are things where prices will go up because Donald Trump has a whim of anger about Brazil. Meanwhile, we do have huge honking trade deficits chronically for decades with a short set of countries. And for most of those countries, a source of that deficit is that they practice what are often called mercantilist policies. There's a whole smorgasbord, huge subsidies, like nothing like what President Biden did for solar and EVs, like huge honking subsidies you can't beat, or suppressing wages, busting domestic unions, keeping wages down, or suppressing consumption. There are a variety of ways you can do that, but it basically forces your population to subsidize your export manufacturing industry, or manipulating the value of your currency, because trade's conducted in dollars. So if your domestic currency is devalued, when you switch it over to dollars, the price is cheaper regardless of what it really costs to make it. Okay, there's a short list of those countries. Literally at this point, it's between 15 and 18 countries. And by the way, we're not talking about the oil and gas exporters or the developing countries that export just diamonds or just gold. We're talking about the manufacturing, mercantilist countries with chronic trade surpluses with the whole dang world. A couple of those, like, Germany, Korea, Japan, biggest one of all, China, have lower tariff rates, the causes of the imbalance, than say, oh, I don't know, Canada, another country we have balanced trade. And in fact, we have a manufacturing trade surplus. 35% tariffs on Canada, 15% right now on Japan and Korea and the European Union, where Germany's tucked in, so that's their rate. This makes no dang sense. And the data that came out at crack of dawn this morning, crack of dawn East Coast time, which is the 6-month trade balance data, is showing that the opposite of what Trump promised is what's happening. So the trade deficit is up, and manufacturing, employment, investment, expansion, orders are down. This is a serious problem.
You're talking about the Commerce Department data showing imports dropped 4% in June.
So I know it seems odd, but the data is 2 months of a lag, so they get it right. Mm-hmm. So in August, we get the June data. So the June data now lets us look at the entire 6 months of 2025. So if you're looking at how trade's working out, it's not really fair to have a new president be responsible for the first quarter of their term, because that's kind of the data from the previous president's policies. But by the time you get to 6 months, you own that. And so overall, our trade deficit, the thing Trump said he'd bring down, is up. It's up on imports. But maybe more scary is we looked at all of the indices of manufacturing. So there's a thing called the PMI. It's an index of purchasing of capital goods and parts and inputs. It's like a crystal ball on manufacturing into the future, but it's used systematically. And if it's above 50%, manufacturing is expanding. If it's below, manufacturing is declining. And the PMI has been down every single month since February of Trump's second term. Or we look at manufacturing employment, down fairly dramatically. So we saw the employment numbers were not great, but it was modest gains, 70,000, except for manufacturing, where it was tens of thousands of losses. And that's the 4th month in a row of that. There are other indexes, and across the board, manufacturing down, deficit up. And again, it's early days. These tariffs have been on, they've been off. That chaos is for sure chilled investment. But if you look at 6 months of I'm using tariffs and trade to bring down the trade deficit and bring up manufacturing, we have the opposite result.
So I want to stick on that Commerce Department data for a moment to make sure I understand how you're making sense of it. Because it seemed like there was a big distorting effect from the announcement of impending tariffs early in the Trump administration. You look at their month-by-month chart, there's a huge spike in imports before tariffs were set to go into effect. Importers stockpiling stuff in American warehouses so they wouldn't have to pay tariffs on it a month later. So if you do like a month-over-month comparison, it looks like imports are dropping, but also exports are dropping by what looks like less. Are you saying if you kind of take a pre-Trump baseline, it looks like the deficit has gone up?
Yeah, the way you need to look at it is not month to month, also because they do adjustments. By the way, friends, these adjustments are natural. You get more data. This is just a side note to the whole Bureau of Labor Statistics meltdown. As the data is reported, over time, corrections come in and all of these data get adjusted. So you look at the US trade deficit data. If you compare 1 month to another month, you may be getting what you just said, which is a month where everyone's rushing to buy imports, or you may get a seasonal effect, or you may just get some data that didn't come in from a particular region and it isn't weighted properly and it gets adjusted. So what you look at is you look at blocks, you look at quarters, you look at halves, and you compare them to other blocks so that the months mush together, so that if there's some anomaly in a month or 2 months, you're not just looking at a fluke between months. So if you look at the US trade deficit, and particularly you look in manufactured goods. So the over top line number is goods and services. And by the way, that trade deficit is, if we still have a deficit, we export more services, we have a huge deficit in goods, we still have a growing trade deficit, even with the services included. But if you want to hone in on the trade thing, you look at manufactured goods. And there's the data, which you can look at, the US Census Department, Department of Commerce has it. You look at manufactured goods as a subset. And so the deficit in manufactured goods, even before this last month, you look at the 5 months, was $174 billion higher in the first 5 months of 2025 than the first 5 months of 2024. So you do the same months, so you don't end up, accidentally throwing in Christmas or something that's fluke. So you compare 2024 to 2025, it's up, way up. But also, you look at just the last 6 months, 5 months of the previous administration, and the deficit is up 30% relative to the last 5 months in 2024. So the trend in the deficit in blocks of time, so you blur out those month-to-month flukes, is bad. It's going in the wrong direction. And what everyone was waiting to look at June to see was, would there actually be now a big drop in imports because the tariffs are starting to kick in? That would be the counter indication of the buying before the tariffs. And the data didn't show the huge decline that was anticipated.
The high tariffs on Canada in particular seem like they would be counterproductive if your goal of the tariff regime was to protect domestic manufacturing. Because, like all the automakers, their supply chains cross the borders in North America. You're just making it more expensive for like Ford to run its plants. In fact, I think Ford reported they have switched in the most recent quarter to unprofitability. They're estimating a $2 billion cost because of the Trump tariffs.
So the Canada situation is sort of a triple whammy. Number one, Canada has, relatively speaking, the same kind of wage levels, environmental standards, and is not a practicer of the major mercantilist abuses that you see with countries that have these chronic trade deficits, that with whom we have, the US has huge chronic trade deficits, and that have surpluses, these countries that are mercantilist, with the whole dang world. China has a trade surplus with Mexico, with India, with South Africa, with Brazil. It's not just us. Okay, Canada, totally different story. The US has balanced trade with Canada if you take out the crude oil, which, if you look at the raw numbers and you don't know how to look at the trade data, with certain countries that have just one big natural resource export, if you want to actually look at the practical balance, you have to take that out. So if you take out crude oil, we have a trade surplus with Canada in everything else, manufactured stuff, et cetera. And I'm just talking goods. I'm not even talking the services. And yes, we are highly integrated. The auto industry is one example, but another one that is, incredibly integrated is aerospace. Now, on the one hand, and this gets to your first point, which is this so dang confusing, companies don't know what the heck to do. Any good that is compliant with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, which is the NAFTA replacement deal that Trump did in 2020, anything that is compliant with that agreement is duty-free. So in the layers of complication of what is charged what, there are a lot of trade lawyers. I'm a recovering one, so I'm not making any money here, but there are a lot of trade lawyers making a lot of money, because if it's compliant with USMCA, which a bunch of those automobiles are, and there's now a weird incentive to make more of them compliant, then the 35% tariff doesn't comply, but stand by. There is a 50% tariff on certain autos that are not US content. But if it complies with the agreement and it is US content, it's duty-free. See how confusing this is? Your overarching point with Canada is we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and that's exactly right. It's the same story with Brazil and other countries with which we have a surplus. So surplus countries are not the countries you want to penalize. Meanwhile, I just want to focus for a second on China. So I had a quality weekend of looking at the Annex 1, which is the actual list of country tariff rates with a bunch of different codes of the so-called Liberation Day, April 2nd tariffs, to try and compare them to the Annex 1 of the official executive order of this delayed, push down the road, the 90-day delay. So that was August 1. I was trying to figure out what actually is the tariff rate for each country relative to the original. And here's a very peculiar detail. China is not in the schedule at all of these tariffs. So the Trump administration's been having this conversation with China, which started out with, we're going to knock you upside the head with a big stick until you stop with these mercantilist abuses and stop dumping all these unfair imports. It got way out of hand. It got over 100%. They then did a ceasefire, and somehow the tables got totally turned. So the last round of negotiations are the US begging China, please, please send us rare earths and magnets, which are key inputs into manufacturing for aerospace, for autos, etc. Somehow we are now chasing around China, asking them to be nice to us when we started out ostensibly trying to tell them, hey, you've got $1 trillion trade deficit with us. Guess what? We're not going to have our markets open. So you either need to clean up your act or sell it someplace else. The whole tables have been turned. And this time around, despite China being by far the biggest factor in our deindustrialization, because it's a serious problem. I mean, we have lost over 6 million net manufacturing jobs, 50,000 factories since China joined the WTO. Everyone who lived through COVID knows we can't make key stuff we need just to keep ourselves safe, just for the sake of resilience. We need to be able to make more stuff, separate from the climate argument of having everything made far away and schlepped, dumping carbon across the oceans, even beyond the economic justice argument of 62% of our fellow Americans in the workforce do not have a college degree and can have great skills making good things paid a decent wage with environmental standards and health safety safeguards for the things we need and want in this country. So we could be importing some stuff, but making more of it. That's a good future. But these particular tariffs that give basically a pass on China, the biggest part of the trade deficit, have relatively low rates for the big mercantilist trade deficit causers like China, like Japan and Korea and Germany, and then have 25 or 35% on countries we have, or 50% with Brazil surpluses with, are exactly backwards.
I I want to drill down for a second on the big picture because I think since Trump took office in the second round, a lot of people have been reflexively defending the status quo ante. And on the face of it, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily a big problem that China has built up the infrastructure to make all manner of manufactured goods incredibly cheaply and ship them to other countries. It's useful to U.S. consumers if they do it through currency manipulation by buying U.S. government debt instruments. It lowers the price of running deficits for our own government. And in the case of some of the sectors that the Chinese government has tried to build up, like solar and battery manufacturing, there's possibly a net benefit for the planet's, attempt to combat climate change. Like, what's intrinsically bad about another country doing a lot of the manufacturing that the consumers in this country rely on?
Well, number one is the conditions that make that stuff so cheap. So a huge share of manufacturing in certain sectors, including solar, is done by forced labor in camps in the western part of China who are Turkmen or Uyghur Muslim minority people who've been rounded up, literally millions, and put in effectively concentration camps. They have now started shipping people with government planes to other parts of the country because the US Congress, in the face of this, which is not just obviously you can't compete with forced labor, but also is immoral and disgusting, the United States Congress, on a bipartisan basis, that doesn't happen a lot, passed a law called the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to try and ban those imports. So what's China done in the last 3 years? They've started shipping people on military planes all over China to hide because there is a presumption anything coming from the Xinjiang region of China was presumed, unless you could prove the supply chain was forced labor free, was presumed not to be admissible here as forced labor goods. And we've had a ban on forced labor since FDR. This is not a new thing. So this was basically applying it to the biggest forced labor problem in the world, which is that part of China. Now these workers are being flown all over. They go with a handler. 500 people get delivered to a factory someplace in the south of China, someplace on the East Coast. And the labor is basically zero expense to the company. And the workers are, locked up, literally are in a prison labor concentration camp situation. That is a huge part of the low wages. The low wages are the low costs. It's also busting any independent labor organizing. So labor protests in China are met with vicious response. And the number of worker suicides, of literally people working to exhaustion and going back at age 35 as a broken person to the village they came from, to a city, is now epidemic. So the conditions you wouldn't want to compete against are part of the problem. In addition to all of the mercantilist conduct, when you think about whether that currency manipulation or the suppression of consumption, what is happening to people in China, there are some very wealthy people in China now, but the people who are making this stuff, their lives are miserable. We don't want to be driving that system, to say nothing of the catastrophe of environmental and climate abuse. So those very cheap solar panels, they are being made with the most vile, carbon spewing, coal-fired power in the world. China puts online, even though China is doing great things, trying to get itself on solar, etc., it still is putting online more of these carbon spewing, high sulfur coal plants than any place in the world. So if you look at what the actual price of those cheap goods are, we don't want that, number one. Number two, what does it mean for our country? When we have lost 50,000 factories, when we have hollowed out the decent jobs available for that almost 2/3 of the American workforce that does not have a college degree, we end up with the statistics we have since 2021 of our life expectancy as a country is declining. And it wasn't COVID, and it wasn't old people, and it wasn't a cancer epidemic. It is working age Americans dying from deaths of despair. And it correlates, and I would like everyone to go look. If you think I'm exaggerating, go to a website called the China Shock. It's a bunch of pro-free trade economists who cut this data. It's coming from regions of the country. And by the way, it's not just the Midwest. Number one job offshoring area is Texas, El Paso. 30,000 Latina women. These were the people who made all of our Levi blue jeans up until 20 years ago. But also it's New York State. It's all over California, where aerospace and computer manufacturing, not just the service end, was vibrant and provided high quality, union supported, good manufacturing jobs that supported communities. Those jobs gone means we have an epidemic of the deaths of despair, which are alcohol, overdose, drugs. We have people dying of chronic diseases that are treatable because they have no health care anymore because they have no job. And we have entire communities drive across the country. Large parts of our communities have been hollowed out, the tax bases that were once supported by these manufacturing plants, and all the other companies that a well-paid manufacturing worker would use. The hair salon, the bowling alley, the cafe, the smaller stores. It's all gone. And in
Lori
that,
Wallach, I
we have
take your point, but your
inequality.
point has exceeded our time constraints. Thank you so much for speaking to us this morning.
Thank you.
Lori Wallach is director of the Rethink Trade program at the American Economic Liberties Project. That takes us to 7:32 in the morning.